If, when you can see it, if you can sit a little bit on the front, that would be great. I'm expecting a full house. Good morning. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. And we're really pleased today to have just a great panel. I don't think you can get a better panel in the world than the three speakers that we have today to talk about innovation, and particularly in the context of the release of a report today that we're releasing called the Atlantic Century, Benchmarking EU and U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness. I want to start by thanking Kay Scholar, the law firm here, who's been so generous to let us use their great space here and all the technology, so we really appreciate that. I also want to thank my colleague Mike Maybach with the European American Business Council. Mike, if you want to just raise your hand. Mike was a supporter of this project, and we really appreciate that. And I finally want to thank my colleague Scott Andis. Scott's back in the very back there, who did the lion's share of the real work on this report, which is to find the data and figure it out and make sense of it all. So Scott did a wonderful job on that. So I want to make maybe 15 minutes of overview comments on the study, on what we found, and then we'll turn it over to my colleagues. But I want to start by introducing them, and we'll go in the order that they are seated. On my immediate left is John Kao, and John really shouldn't need an introduction. He's really one of the world's leading advocates and apostles of innovation. He has been dubbed Mr. Creativity, a serial innovator by The Economist magazine. Dr. Kao describes his job description as an instigator of new things, and that's somebody that we definitely need to have more of. He's considered a leading authority on innovation, organizational transformation, and digital media. He's author of a couple of best-selling books, Jamming, The Art and Discipline of Business Creativity, which is a Business Week bestseller, and also author of Innovation Nation, which I believe was 2008. And if you haven't read Innovation Nation, go to Amazon and buy it today. It is a wonderful book that looks at why innovation is so central to America's economic success and what other nations are doing in it and what we should do to succeed. So John works with a range of public and private sector clients on a global basis and helping them figure out and communicate about innovation. On his left is Vivek Wadhwa, and again, Vivek should need no introduction. If you read Business Week, you should be reading Vivek. He is an executive in residence at Duke University and a regular columnist for Business Week on technology entrepreneurship. He is also a fellow with the Labor and Work-Life program at Harvard Law School, and where he prepares students on and leads groundbreaking research on globalization and U.S. competitive advantage. If you haven't read Vivek's research, maybe you can say the URL when you get up there, but he really has done the best research in the last 2 years on really documenting entrepreneurship, innovation, and in particular the role of foreign migrants to the U.S. and what they have done. He's been a pioneer of change and innovation in the IT industry. He's founded 2 software companies. He's helped solve some of the most daunting problems when he was heading IT at CS First Boston, where he's Vice President of Information Services. He spun off of that company to create Sear Technologies and helped the company grow to be a $118 million publicly traded company. He then went on and started another company called Relativity Technologies, which was named the 25 Coolest Technology Company by Fortune magazine. He holds an MBA at New York University and BA in Computing Studies from Canberra in Australia, and has been on, as I said, Business Week, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and a host of other media. And finally, on the far left is Chuck Vest. Again, all of you should know Dr. Vest. He's the former president of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and just recently became the head of the National Academy of Engineering. He earned his PhD, his BS, MSc, and PhDs in mechanical engineering, and in 1981 became a professor of mechanical engineering, and then became a dean at University of Michigan. And in 1990 he became president of MIT, held that position until 2004. And he, during his tenure at MIT, he really spearheaded a whole new set of initiatives, the Open Courseware Initiative, which you're all familiar with, the Alliance for Global Sustainability, new institutes on genomics and neuroscience, and a whole set of other things. As I said, in 2007, he's at the National Academy of Engineering. And I should add, he was also the vice chair of the Council on Competitiveness, and was the real leader, or a leader, behind the report, The Gathering Storm, which, again, you've all seen and read. So with that, I want to thank the panelists. We will adjourn precisely at 11. Normally we go to 10:30, but it's such a great panel, we'll go an extra half hour today. Well, let me just jump in and start. As I said, we did this report really because we wanted to get a better sense of where the U.S. is in innovation-based competitiveness. There have been a number of studies that have come out that essentially either use data or argumentation to make the point that the U.S. is number one, and essentially everything is pretty good, just kind of keep it up. There's no real crisis, there's no real need to do anything differently. We did not go into this study with a preconception of what we were going to find, but what we did want to do was have a study that was based on objective and quantitative data. A number of the other studies that have been done are largely opinion surveys, and they ask people, what's your opinion, who has the most R&D or who has the most venture capital? And not surprisingly, the U.S. does quite well in opinion surveys. We're still riding on our legacy of being the best. As you see, when we look at actual data, the picture's a little more complicated. So what we did is we looked at 40 nations and regions. The countries are all the EU, the EU 25, the NAFTA countries, Australia, Brazil, China, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and Singapore. There's a screen over there if you want to watch that one too.
How innovative.
Yes. And then the regions, EU 10, 15, 25, and NAFTA. We looked at 6 groups of indicators, 16 indicators totally. Human capital, and I should add, all of these indicators, by the way, are adjusted for size of the country, the number of workers, and some denominator that reflect country size. Human capital, college education, number of scientific researchers, corporate R&D, government R&D, scientific publications. Entrepreneurship, we looked at the number of new firms as well as the amount of venture capital. IT infrastructure, e-government, corporate IT investment, and broadband. Economic policy, we looked at effective corporate tax rate and the ease of doing business. And then economic performance, we looked at 4 indicators: the trade balance, inward FDI, foreign direct investment, GDP per worker, and GDP per hour. So this is kind of the conventional view. World Economic Forum has had us listed as number 1, 2 or 3 years in a row, if not more. The Economist has a study that lists us as number 1. So the notion is we may be bruised and battered right now, but we're still number 1. We'll continue to be number 1. You know, what me worry. In fact, we're actually number 6 in these 40 countries. So we're not number 1. The countries that are ahead of us, you can see Singapore, and John will talk a little bit about Singapore. I hope he's really the expert on Singapore and documented exactly what they've done to get there. But Sweden, Luxembourg, Denmark, South Korea. Now, one argument you'll hear is, well, these are small countries. Anybody can do that in small countries. It requires very little difference to have a good R&D tax credit in a small country than a big country. It requires very little difference to put a lot of money behind R&D on a per capita basis in a small country than a big country. So while small countries may have some advantages, frankly they have some disadvantages. It's harder to do e-government in small countries because you can't amateurize over a large base. So I think that I think this is a legitimate set of countries to benchmark against. And I would add, by the way, we looked at 40 countries overall, but we narrowed in on about 20, 22 as benchmark comparators, and that's what you'll be seeing here. You can see the scores there. The U.S. is 6th. It's behind Singapore and Sweden, which are quite high. And you can see when you go down to the tail end here, India, for everything we hear about India being this great engine, it really still is a country that's fairly far behind. It has some pockets of innovation and pockets of technology, but it really hasn't been able to move up the ladder. Well, it has moved up, but it's at that level. Now, the other thing we did, which I don't believe any report has ever done, is we didn't just look at where the U.S. is today. We looked at where the countries were in some kind of benchmark year. It's difficult to get data for exactly the same year, so some was 99, some was 2003, but it's sort of around the 2000, 2001 area. And we said, okay, if you put all those together, take the standard deviations, add them all up, who's made the most progress? Who's made the least progress? Well, the U.S. is behind. We're behind these countries in terms of progress. So in terms of how much countries have moved ahead in the 16 innovation-based indicators, the U.S. is behind every single country. We're dead last. So we have made very little progress, and other countries, as you can see, have made more progress. So a country like China, that's perhaps not a surprise, given everything we read and hear about China. But other countries, Denmark, here's a country that is close to us in per capita income. This is not a case of convergence where it's low-income countries can easily do this. Luxembourg, Japan. I mean, again, people think about Japan and the conventional wisdom on Japan, basket case, wasted decade of the 90s, they're not doing very well. In fact, Japan is doing quite well. We just don't see it because they have a declining population, because they have so many old people, their working age population is declining. So if you look at the overall metric of that, it doesn't look good, but if you look at these other ones, Japan does very well. India, again, so every single country has made faster progress. And here you see that, again, the rate of progress in Singapore, number one in the world. One of the reasons they're number one in the world is because they've made such rapid progress in the last 8 to 9 years. Other countries, you see the progress India is making. South Korea, again, a country that's pretty far along the development path, but has just decided to put innovation at the center of its economic policies. So I'm going to go through a few of these indicators. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some I'll let you change, some I'll do both. The president last night talked about the importance of college education. If you look at where the U.S. ranks on the countries we can find data on the change metric, and the U.S. is last in terms of the number of people graduating from college. Other countries have made significant progress. Again, South Korea, a country like Poland, where they started from a lower level, but again, Ireland, very high levels now of college education. Scientific researchers. And this is you can see that this is the number of scientific researchers in a country. Sweden, way ahead. Japan, way ahead. It's interesting if you look at on the far end, though, China, Mexico, Brazil, India, countries that we think are really pretty far along, in fact, are not very far along on this metric. They have a few good sites, a few good enterprises, but overall they're not. In terms of change of researchers, in other words, how many researchers were there in '99, how many are in 2005, which is, by the way, all the data we have are the latest data that are available. Sometimes it's just not very recent because of data limitations. But you can see China doubling the number of researchers in less than 6 years. Mexico, again, doing very well. South Korea, Singapore, U.S., we've made some improvement, but not very much. Corporate R&D. It's interesting, in the World Economic Forum study lists the U.S. as #1 in corporate R&D, which is based on an opinion survey asking executives who's got the most R&D. When you actually look at the numbers that are published by governments on amount of money companies invest in R&D, you can see that we're #5, we're not #1. Sweden, Japan, South Korea, Germany a little bit ahead of us. These are all obviously in the report. Now if you look at the change in corporate R&D, perhaps not a surprise, but look at China. Massive growth in corporate R&D. Much of that multinational R&D, moving their R&D facilities there. But even Mexico, Korea, Australia, Singapore, Spain. Spain, by the way, has, I believe, one of the highest R&D tax credits in the world now. You wouldn't think of that, and I would argue that's probably one of the reasons you're seeing that. Certainly other factors in Spain are contributing, but that's a contributing factor. U.S., negative growth in corporate R&D as a share of GDP. Government support for R&D, critical components of success. U.S. ranks pretty well, fourth behind Singapore, France, Sweden. But now if you look at change, there's virtually no change in government R&D as a share of GDP. Look at some of these other countries, Ireland, Spain, Korea, Russia, China, Canada. Canada's made a big push to increase their R&D. So again, all these other countries making, not all, but many making national commitments to do that. Venture capital, this was one of the bigger surprises to us, because we all think, well, okay, these other countries, they might be good at government R&D, but we're the best in the market. We really have the innovative marketplace. We know how to do VC. Well, in fact, we do, but other countries are doing it better. Sweden, UK, South Korea, Singapore, all with more venture capital investment as a share of GDP than the United States. Now, it's interesting, you look at some countries that are pretty innovative and technology-based, like Japan, not doing very much VC at all. Japan's strength, if you will, is really about corporate innovation. It's not about entrepreneurial innovation. New firms change. This is a metric on, as I said, I didn't put them all in, but this is how many new firms are in an economy versus about 8 years ago. And you can see, again, Singapore, India, dramatic increase in the number of new firms. But again, Sweden, Ireland, EU10. I mean, one of the overall messages here, I should add, is if you benchmark us against Europe, we are ahead of the European Union, the EU15, clearly the EU10 even more. But when you look at rate of progress, the EU10, the EU15 are rapidly gaining on us. In fact, we estimate by 2020, at current rates of growth, the EU15, which are the big countries in Europe, will exceed the US on these metrics in innovation capacity. Broadband. This is an interesting metric where we put together two metrics, two data sets. One was adoption, so the percent of the population with broadband, but the other is broadband speed and quality, which was a study done out of Oxford that looked at how fast broadband connections are, what level of latency, other quality metrics. And I think it's interesting when you look there, counter to a lot of the popular wisdom here in Washington, the US exceeds Europe in broadband. I'm not saying we exceed every single country. As you see, there are some countries there in Sweden, for example, and France. But overall, the US is doing better than Europe, slightly better in terms of broadband. Interesting there, you see Japan is the world leader. 80% of homes plus can get 100 meg fiber to the home or to the apartment complex. Korea the same way, not as many, but still a wide variety. A wide number of homes in Korea have fiber or super fast cable. IT investments, this is the amount of corporate IT that's being invested. A little bit of a surprise there, China exceeding the US now. And this would be IT investments made by banks, made by hospitals, made by insurance companies. But interesting, a lot of countries are somewhat in the same place. Now if you look at change, big leader there, India, though by far just jumping up on IT investment. Now partly that's IT offshoring to India, partly it's their own indigenous growth of using IT. Another metric on business climate or policy, if you look at effective corporate tax rate, which is actually highly correlated with FDI, I believe it's about a 0.4 correlation, the lower the rate, the more FDI a country gets. You can see the US is the worst, has the highest effective corporate tax rate of any of these countries. Ireland, which we've all heard about as a model or a success story, but many of these other countries, the EU15 as a whole, for example, about 50% less in terms of corporate tax rate. Trade balance, which we do think is an important indicator. I know there's some in Washington who think trade balance doesn't matter. I think it actually does matter. I think it's a somewhat accurate reflection of performance. We all hear about China with a big trade balance. I have no idea what Singapore is doing, but they are running a huge trade surplus. And again, you look at the U.S. on the very last on that metric. Trade balance change. This is how much change there's been on a percentage point basis. U.S. trade balance has gone down. Interesting, South Korea has gone down, and Japan, and that's partly a reflection of what there used to be their trade surpluses and now have moved over to China. They're both running trade surpluses, but smaller than before. FDI change. How many countries? What's been the growth in inward foreign direct investment? Very interesting. You would expect China to be way up there, and I don't know why they're not, other than their overall economy is growing faster than their FDI, obviously. But India, Russia, obviously starting from a low base and had a lot of problems in the early part of the decade. GDP per working age adult, this is kind of the gold standard. This is how rich are we. And the U.S. is the richest, except for Luxembourg, which is not on the chart. You can see India and China. Look how far down they are. They're around anywhere between 7 to 12% of U.S. per capita income. They have a long, long way to go before they can catch up. Now, if you look at change, though, you can see some of these other countries making rapid change. U.S. not bad, but certainly not anywhere near some of the growth of these other countries. And by the way, so if you look at some of these other countries, UK, Sweden, Germany, Japan, these again rich countries, well developed, but they're making faster progress on this core metric. Productivity, this is taking out how many people are working. Just the people who are working, how much are they producing per hour? U.S. does pretty well. Big surprise, Ireland #1. Again, you look at productivity change. U.S. doesn't do too bad. That's been a strength of the U.S. economy. In fact, it's a very interesting fact that in the last 2 recessions, this one and the last one, productivity growth has been 10 times faster than productivity growth in all the recessions prior to that, back in 1947. So there's something about the U.S. economy today that is able to sustain high productivity rates, even when in recessions, normally productivity goes way, way down, if not negative. So let me just close by saying, what are the policy implications of that? Having worked for a governor at one time involved in leading economic policy efforts, it was very clear to me that states understand that they are essentially market takers, not market makers. They're all, even a state like California, looks to themselves as a small fish in the global pond, and if they don't get their act together and put in place aggressive innovation and economic development policy, they know they're going to get left behind. Even Republican governors who might be, say, pro-market, why would they intervene in their economies? Republican governors know a simple core truth, which is markets work, but they may not work to the advantage of their citizens. So that's why governors are interventionists, Republican and Democrat. That's why every single governor has a proactive economic development and innovation policy. Here in the U.S., we largely think that we're immune to that. It's time for the U.S. to essentially come to the realization that we are essentially like a large state. It's a giant global economy. Prosperity is not guaranteed for us until we take the kinds of steps we need. So in some ways, that's the big message. We've got to just essentially say, we're in competition, we've got to take aggressive steps to meet it. The second thing is, we need to do it, think about it the right way. We can't be relying on Adam Smith, in other words, the market's going to solve it all. We can't be relying on John Maynard Keynes to say, if we just pump up consumer demand, everything's going to be swell. What we need to follow is my hero, Joseph Schumpeter, my guide, if you will. Schumpeter is basically the godfather of innovation economics. It was Schumpeter who said it's innovation, new firms, new business models, new markets. That's what drives growth. That's what drives success. And we really need to recognize that in Washington. We can't just rely on the old-fashioned and frankly stale economic doctrines. Just a few implications, I think. We need to put in place incentives. We can't just focus on the supply side, we have to focus on the demand side. So we have the 17th most generous R&D tax credit now of 30 OECD nations. In 1992, we were the most generous. But countries like Spain, Mexico, France, Canada, they've all put in place more generous tax incentives than we have. We need to be open to high-skill immigration, and Vivek will talk about how important that is. We need to foster a digital economy. As much as people may say, well, the digital economy, that was yesterday, the digital economy is today and the future. And you look at what other countries are doing, and it's striking how they're transforming their healthcare systems, their transportation systems, their government, their schools, using IT. We need to support institutions that are critical innovation. In other words, one of the things states do so well is they don't just say we're going to give money to universities. They do that, as they should. But they say we're going to put in place institutions that help transfer that. So research parks, technology transfer programs, venture capital programs, a whole set of supporting things that are part of the ecosystem. And again, John can talk about how important that ecosystem is. And finally, and this, I would say in some ways maybe applies more to Europe than the U.S., but certainly applies to the U.S. as well. You need to have a regulatory system that is pro-innovation, that every single regulatory and procurement action should be guided in part by, is this going to support innovation or is it going to retard it? And oftentimes I think policymakers who are trying to do the right thing miss that point and end up retarding innovation. So with that, I will say thank you, and we'll turn it over to John for his remarks.
Well, if I had known I was going to be introduced as an innovation apostle, I would have worn some flowing robes. But I do want to share with you one other point about nicknames, because I've been working in the innovation field now for over 20 years, and so you accumulate nicknames. My favorite nickname from this motley collection of experiences that I've accumulated during that period came from the U.S. Navy when I was working with them on the aircraft carrier program, which, as you might imagine, is in need of some innovation. And after about a year of that engagement, someone turned to me and said, "Oh, I get it. You're the innovation Sherpa. You're not like us, but somehow I think you have a sense of how to get us to this kind of mountaintop that we're calling innovation." So my lot in life these days is really to work with teams of people. It started off being very much in the private sector, but of late my experiences have ranged from guiding teams that are stewards of innovation for the heartland of America, Dayton, Ohio being a recent example, to countries like Finland and Singapore that are, as we've just learned, in leading positions in the innovation sweepstakes out there, where in a sense I've come in almost like a coach to help them train in a slightly different way so that they can be more competitive within this landscape. So given that body of experience, it's a particularly welcome opportunity to be able to collaborate with ITIF and to comment on this terrific study that's come out. And I'll just make a few observations, both in terms of the study itself, the subject of metrics in general, what the metrics actually might be saying that go beyond the numbers, and then a few policy implications that come from that. So first of all, the study itself. I mean, obviously, the biggest obstacle to having a national agenda for innovation in this country is the feeling of a sense of urgency. If you follow John Cotter's work on transformation and change management, he says, if at least the majority of people in your organization do not feel a sense of urgency, nothing will happen. And it takes a Pearl Harbor to galvanize naval innovation. It takes something else to galvanize attention on a renewed, or in fact a new innovation agenda. Because I think there are a lot of ways in my experience where innovation quickly becomes a bumper sticker or simply an extension to conventional economic and econometric thinking. And that may be okay from a limited point of view, but I think we're after a bigger ambition here. And in our time together this morning, I think we have an opportunity really to talk that through. So I think the study is valuable because it creates a sense of urgency. It creates a sense that these are dynamic processes. There are flows. There are trends over time, and alarmingly, the trend lines are not quite favorable for us. And also, it suggests then the raw materials for a strategy, because we can't really have a strategy unless we know where we stand, and unless we know where we stand, especially relative to other countries. Now, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is an illustration from a Harvard Business Review article that's just come out. I wrote it, and it just came out in the current March issue on the new geography of innovation. And I will only say that what we did was we took this tool called a cartogram, and we input some variables that, some of which intersect with the ITIF study, some of which are a basket of variables that look at how forward-leaning and future-oriented a country is. And regardless of the variables, you get some variation on this kind of a landscape, which does in fact show that the U.S. is, as Rob said, like a state. It's an important player, but it's a player among many. And that there are a number of surprises in terms of countries that may be quite small in terms of their population or their landmass. I mean, if you've been to Singapore, you know that there's almost no there there. But by the same token, that when we're talking about innovation, there's an interesting non-linearity to the innovation equation, which is different from agriculture or industrial manufacturing as an economic base. Singapore, for instance, which has decided that there are 3 areas of interest: life sciences, digital media, and water and environmental technology. These are their 3 big plays. Has created what I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is the Singapore Biopolis, which is a gorgeous, Zaha Hadid master-planned city within a city for life sciences. And it's a full-blown ecosystem that includes everything from, space for venture capital and corporate and government labs, to an extreme sports venue and a concert hall and a lot of incredibly good restaurants. The key point about Biopolis is that the plan by early next decade is to have somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 PhD scientists resident there from all different parts of the world. Now that's 50 to 70% of all of the PhD scientists at the National Institutes of Health. All right, which just goes to show you that a 5+ million person population country, which started off with no natural resources and has no land, right, can basically become, at the innovation sweepstakes level, a major contender, because it's non-linear. It's not a linear function necessarily of population or even of GDP or of land mass. It's a function of other things that have to do with national will and intent and investment strategy and being really smart about innovation. So let me switch gears. So this is just here as eye candy because, in fact, this is, in some respects, an articulation of what's been said through this terrific analysis contained in the report, but in visual terms. And it leads me then to the second thing I want to talk about briefly, which is the subject of metrics itself. From where I sit, somewhere in between here and the summit of whatever mountain we're talking about, there's a lot of activity going on in the area of metrics. OECD has a metrics team, and I'm sure World Economic Forum and Council on Competitiveness are going to come back and have their say again. And Nesta in the UK, which is a charity that focuses, among other things, as the kind of innovation skunk works in the UK, is just about to mount a large effort in metrics. So we're going to hear a lot about this topic. And in some respects, I'd like to say that it reminds me of the kind of pre-Copernican era in astronomy. We don't still have one unified set of concepts around which we can hang metrics so that we can create alignment, not only within our country, in terms of what we should be focusing on, but at a global level. And this relates to a fundamental challenge around the subject of innovation, which is that most of us, to be honest, still have a hard time defining what it is. In this era, innovation has become the big thing we want. Just like in the 80s, everybody wanted to be an entrepreneur instead of a bureaucrat, right? So now everybody wants to be innovative because nobody wants to be uninnovative, but it still begs the question of what innovation means. And so metrics are basically going to be a reflection of what your deep assumptions are about what innovation is. They're only as good as the definitions to which they're applied. It's a paraphrase of that old Abraham Maslow notion that, the only tool you have is a hammer, you'll treat every problem like a nail, right? So if you have a certain limited view of what innovation is, then the metrics will kind of collude with that, and then everybody will feel like they've done a great job and go home and say, oh yeah, we checked off the innovation box. And in fact, the important things won't have been done. So, in terms of metrics, it matters a great deal how sophisticated one's definition of innovation is. And where I sit, innovation isn't just one thing. There is a sad tendency, especially in the public sector world, to conflate innovation with science and technology, right? As if innovation was about people in white coats in labs at the eureka moment, right? So discovery is clearly important, but also the ability to develop, to scale up, to prototype, to design for people, to experiment, to convert the fruits of discovery into successful business models, all right? So if you just go out and you count patents or labs or PhDs in molecular biology, you're going to get part of the equation. But it leaves a lot unanswered or unaddressed. So, let me give you a data point from Finland, one of my favorite examples these days. So Finland is a pretty smart country. It has a very high per capita array of institutions of higher education. Okay? Parliament in Finland, because of Finland's ongoing desire to be an innovation-driven society and economy, recently mandated that 3 of their crown jewel institutions, TKK, which is sort of the MIT of Finland, right, the technical university, the School of Art and Design, and the Business School, were to merge. And that merger is happening right now, and it's going to actually officially launch later this year. Okay? And the motivation is mostly, I think, not about denominator management in the sense of cost containment. It's mostly because they recognize, or they assume, and I think correctly, that innovation isn't just about what happens in the lab. It's about what happens in the interfaces between a high-tech person, a designer who deeply understands user experience and tacit needs, and designs for deep sort of human requirements, right? And then the business model innovation and the business skills, which allows for the effective transition of discovery into the marketplace. So in a sense, what they're doing, and you'll hear more about this Alvar Aalto University, as they're now calling it, is a big bet around a redefinition of innovation, which of course right away you'd say, wow, that means that there are other things we should be measuring, right? Maybe we should be looking at design schools, right? Or maybe we should be looking at, even unpacking this notion of startups more and thinking about, who in society is involved in transitioning technology, okay? So all I'm trying to say is it matters a great deal how you actually define innovation, and there I think are a lot of ways in which our understanding of innovation needs to expand. So I'm thinking that maybe a decade or 2 decades from now, if we are in this kind of Kuhnian paradigm shift frame of mind, with all of this activity around a need and a desire for a new approach to metrics, the scales will tip, and we'll actually have one where, if you go to the chief innovation stakeholder in England or Shanghai or Dayton, Ohio or Washington, D.C., they're going to be speaking the same language, which I assure you is not the case right now. I've just stood up an NGO called the Institute for Large-Scale Innovation. It's based in San Francisco. One of our first activities is to convene a summit meeting of some of the chief innovation, effectively the chief innovation officers of countries. And one of the first things we're going to be doing is actually working with them around this question of what do metrics mean, what do you expect from them, and how can we create some alignment so we can begin to talk about the same thing, right? Because one of the implications of a globalized world in terms of innovation is that we have to not only think in terms of competitiveness in the old way, right? What's good for me is not necessarily good for you, so I have an unfair advantage. But sort of, infinite game, non-zero sum, how does my improving my capability help you to improve yours, which in turn improves mine? So this whole notion of linkages of innovation capabilities is a very real outcome of this new geography of innovation. One of the things that I notice in the Bay Area a lot are entrepreneurs who are now using what I call born global business models. That is to say, well, I'll give you one example. I have a friend who started a cardiovascular drug biotech kind of company. And 15 years ago, he would have had 200 to 300 people in South San Francisco. He would have had, among other things, the head of regulatory, and then the deputy head of regulatory, and then a compliance person, and a couple of lawyers. I mean, all this cascade of consequences from having to comply with local conditions and build a real biotech company, right? 200 to 300 people. He has 9 people in an office building in San Francisco in the financial district, no PhDs, everything is outsourced to other countries. The medicinal chemistry is done in India, the clinical trials are being done in East Europe, the molecule was licensed from Italy. Most of the value is still going to be captured in the US, right? The business model innovation is coming from the US, right? So this is a harbinger maybe of our kind of role and model, business model for innovation in the world as other countries adopt their version of a smart model for them. So the third point I want to address is what's the subtext of this study, which I think is really interesting. I mean, we would not be harvesting the value of the study if we just walked away with a bunch of numbers and a few factoids. I mean, I think there's a lot going on in the study. For example, why is China so high in terms of publications, which is a metric of science and technology? Well, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that in China right now, there's actually a policy called indigenous innovation, which measures academics based on the number of scientific papers they publish and the number of patents they apply for. So it's an industrial age model, management model, applied to sort of the innovation environment. So if you want to get promoted, if you want to get the bigger apartment, you're going to produce, right? And other countries have a different game board, so different things are going to be valued. Similarly, in Singapore, why is Singapore in the study such a hotbed of startups and venture capital even? And frankly, if I were looking for money for a startup that I was doing, I wouldn't go to Singapore because I could get late stage money after I had demonstrated profitability and had 100 people in my company, but nobody's going to give me money on the basis of an idea on the back of a napkin, which is still the great strength of the United States in terms of our early stage venture capital infrastructure. 3 minutes, okay, we're right on track here. But the thing about Singapore, which is interesting, is that they have decided that they are going to deliberately create new crops of startups. And they're going to also attract early stage companies to Singapore in a strategy that they call polishing the jewels, right? So originated in Silicon Valley, but developed and polished in Singapore, all right? So therefore, their metrics for new companies are going to be quite high. So what does this mean for us? Well, I've been described as a bit of an evangelist for a national innovation agenda in our country. I still believe that we're not there at a national level, and I'm worried about it because I see us defaulting to an emphasis on science and technology at the expense of a broader view of innovation, which would enable a whole-of-government approach to certain large-scale wicked problems for which innovation in this more contemporary sense could be the answer. We have a lack of stewardship of innovation in this country. If you were in Sweden, you say, I want to talk to the person who's responsible for innovation, policy, and investment. You go to the phone book, you look up Vinnova, it's the Swedish Agency for Innovation Policy and Strategy and Investment. Bada boom, there's the person you call, right? We don't have a phone number in the federal directory. We don't have, anything like that. And if we're going to be, maintain and even develop our model for innovation as a country, we're not going to be able to just wing it or just simply get nervous because a study says we're not doing well and then go back to business as usual. There's going to have to be stewardship, there's going to have to be strategy, there's going to have to be a more contemporary view of innovation, there's going to have to be investment around innovation, not along conventional lanes, but around foundry busting, silo busting, opportunities and platforms that will allow all of the things that we're so good at, our ethos, our values, our the whole social psychology of innovation in our country to really continue to flower, but then to drive strategies that are smart and aligned with what's going on in the rest of the world. Not that I have any opinions about this.
Thank you.
I've often said that I'm a tech entrepreneur lost in academia. I've actually come to this whole universe without having any background. And I've been amazed at how little understanding we have of what's happening in the world and how flawed all of the data that I've seen is. I talk about the fact that I've become a myth buster, going around challenging issue after issue, and no one seems to be able to take me on. Now, Rob is one of the few people I've come across who really seems to understand what's going on, and he's been doing a lot of the same through his research and through his studies. Now, in this case, what they did basically was that they challenged the standard OECD reports and other reports which said that the US is leading. And what he did was he put together a new set of criteria for looking at it. Now, I'm not sure if these criteria are the right criteria and what the results mean. When you have Finland being the leading company, why do we care about Finland? I don't know. But the fact that you have a small country like Finland up there is what's relevant. And then the fact that you have all these other countries doing so well in so many other dimensions is relevant as well. What the report, I think, does more than anything else is to say that, hey, our data is imperfect. We don't get it. We need to start looking at many other factors, and we need to start developing historical models and looking for what we don't know. Because I think the US is caught up in its in data from 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we're totally out of touch. So again, I mean, a lot of information, which just the fact that we're producing the information is what's relevant over here. Now, I've been doing research into a number of areas myself, and I started off with a silly little research project on engineering graduation rates, which created a firestorm. All we did was we looked at who was graduating what, and we said that the US really isn't in that much trouble. We looked at the engineering numbers. Now, when I started researching it further, I realized that the US is in serious trouble. That even though we may not be graduating as many engineers sorry, we may be graduating, comparable number of engineers to other countries. The problem is that we're not creating the excitement in the engineering profession. We're not focusing our best minds on science and engineering problems and innovation and so on and so on. So there's a dimension to that which doesn't come out by just looking at the data. Okay. Now, in this case, you have 16 different data points that have come up. When you look at the composite, you begin to get a picture saying that, hey, maybe we are in trouble over here. Now, I've been looking at it anecdotally. I've been going to India and China and looking at what's been happening over there. And I see a much more worrisome trend. And I see a hollowing out happening in a lot of our key technologies. John gave an example of the pharmaceutical industry. Well, if you can have a company of 9 people having outsourced virtually all of their R&D to other parts of the world, what does this mean for us in the long term? That means that the masses aren't going to be here in the USA anymore, and which means that the spin-offs aren't going to be over here, which means that the next startups, the next major companies won't be here, they'll be globally. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the fact is that we're not aware of it. We're complacent. We don't seem to understand what's happening over there. Another dimension to the debate that we sort of think that American companies are American companies, and a lot of data that we have looks at companies which originate in the USA or which have addresses in the USA, and then look at their numbers. Now, a lot of, again, go back to the pharmaceutical industry because John brought that example up. A lot of the major big pharma, right now are doing their R&D in India, they're doing clinical testing in China, and they're doing discovery in other parts of the world. So they're moving thousands, if not tens of thousands of people to basically over the last decade or so, they have moved tens of thousands of their most sophisticated R&D jobs abroad. So when the downturns happen, as you're seeing right now, all the people who get laid off aren't going to be starting companies here, they're going to be starting companies globally. Now, that's something you don't see in the data, even if even the best data that Rob puts together won't reflect where the R&D is because companies don't disclose that. So the bottom line is, there's a lot to worry about. Now, when you talk about this dispersion of knowledge, another thing to consider is that now we're, when we talk about innovation, when we talk about all the metrics we're talking about, it's basically all knowledge bound. It's now all of the productivity that's happening, all the creativity that's happening in these areas is happening in the minds of people. Because that's in the tech world in particular, it's all about knowledge. It's all about your ability to understand what the problems are and then come up with creative solutions. If you look at all these leading companies, the Googles, Apple, Microsoft, and so on, it's all been ideaware. So people are behind it. Now, if you look at the data, half of the Silicon Valley startups were founded by immigrants, people who weren't born in the United States. They brought ideas from all over the world, and they fertilized the most fertile area in America, Silicon Valley. A quarter of all the startups in the United States are founded by immigrants in the tech sector, tech and engineering sector. Now, if you go to our universities, go to our engineering schools, go to see what type of research is being done there, you'll find that there's an abundance of foreign nationals. In engineering in particular, roughly 60% of the PhDs are foreign nationals. Now, I've got nothing against foreign nationals. The problem is that if those foreign nationals come here and they don't contribute to your long-term competitiveness, you have a little bit of a problem. Because again, you're losing all the knowledge, you're losing all the people that will be creating the next generation of companies. If you go last 2 or 3 weeks, there've been front page stories all over the United States about H-1B visas. It's like a witch hunt against the banks, which happen to hire 0.01% of their employees from abroad over 6 years or so before they took the bailout. I mean, all sorts of stupid stories circulating about scandal this, scandal that, as if hiring a foreign national is a crime, that they basically have done something disloyal by doing that. Now, what we forget in all these debates is that these banks basically, a large chunk of the deposits they have are for foreign nationals. the money that's coming to bail us out is coming from abroad. So also, if you look at American companies we consider to be American. IBM, 65% of IBM's revenue, 65% of IBM's revenue comes from overseas. Hewlett Packard, 69% of Hewlett Packard's revenue comes from overseas. Caterpillar, 51% of Caterpillar's revenue comes from overseas. So all of these companies are now global, they're not Americans anymore. So now coming back to the immigration debate, we have a witch hunt against foreign nationals. The problem is that they're beginning to return home in droves. That there's no hard data available. There's anecdotal data which says that the rate of return of skilled foreign workers in the United States has increased by a factor of 10 over the last 5 years or so. This data is based on meetings that I've had with the hiring managers of companies in India and China. You go there and they'll tell you all these stories. You go there, visit the labs, you'll see returnees from India and China fueling the R&D that's happening in those countries. You go to India, you see not hundreds, which is thousands, you see tens of thousands of people in these magnificent R&D labs where they're developing the next generation of technologies for American companies. You don't read about it in the press here, you don't have any data which shows that. But there's a lot happening abroad, and it's being fueled by returnees from the USA. So we have a report coming out next week which basically shows how these returnees are doing. The people that we don't seem to care about, they're basically going back and they're doing much better back home than they were over here. They went back because of opportunity. They have a better quality of life. They have their families are better off. By every dimension, people who have come here to study and work, who have now gone back to the home countries, are doing much better back home. The students I talked about, I have another paper coming out 6 weeks from now, in which we interviewed foreign students in the United States. The vast majority of them see the grass being much greener on the other side. They see much more opportunities back in India and China than they see in the USA. You ask them if they want to stay, typically from the Indian and Chinese, 60 to 80% of them, if not more, have stayed here and made America their home. I was surprised that only 6% of the Indians, 10% of the Chinese, 15% of the Europeans now talk about making America their permanent home. And given all the paranoia, given the xenophobia, given all that's happening, they were going to basically push back the entire next generation of foreign students who are already in our universities. Bottom line is that we've created a mess for ourselves, not in one area, but in many areas, and we just don't know it. We don't have any data that shows it. We don't have any understanding of the problem, and we're basically clueless. So this is why, again, I was delighted to be able to come here and talk about the report today, because this is one step forward. That we're now gathering data on a variety of areas. But again, my worry is that the dimension behind that, the seepage that's happening, and the hollowing out that's happening of the most critical R&D in the United States. We don't understand it, and we have no policies to react to it. Now, what sort of things should we be doing? For example, right now we can't stop outsourcing. We can't stop R&D moving abroad. And I mean, even if we had, even if we did what the President said yesterday, of not giving incentives to companies to offshore their R&D, nothing would happen, because companies aren't moving abroad because of government incentives. They're doing it because it makes sense for them. It's cheaper for them, and that's where they see their growth. They're going to go where the growth is. They're going to go where the markets are. If Hewlett Packard gets 70% of its revenue from abroad, you can bet that they're going to have 70% of their R&D workers abroad, because that's what they have to do. That's where the money is coming from. So that's going to happen. How do we now react to it? The only solutions I see are to improve our education, to do what Finland is doing, basically moving its education system to the next level and being more innovative in the way we train our students. We need to do the same thing with our workforce. That right now, American companies treat their people as if they were big lighters, basically disposable assets. That you're expected to come in and do the exact task that the university's trained you for. You're expected to know everything coming in the door. And once you have done that, you're basically thrown away. You're replaced with cheaper workers. Our companies don't invest in training the workforce anymore. I did a very detailed report called How the Disciple Became the Guru. The subheading was, is it time for the US to learn workforce development from its former disciple, India? Because the reason why India became such a success in IT, and the reason why it's doing much better in R&D than you can imagine, the data that Rob showed up there, it doesn't capture even 1% of what's happening in India right now. The reason why they did that was because they started investing in their workforce. Sorry, not the government. The industry started investing in their workforce. They developed workforce development techniques which are way outside anything we've ever seen in the United States. Better than what we had in the 60s and 70s in the USA. So what we have to do basically is implement policies for retraining our workforce at a national level, because it's great to rely upon, we keep focusing on K-12 education. K-12 education is important, but the innovation that we need isn't going to come from our children. It's going to come from the existing workforce, because that's where entrepreneurs come from. It's from our existing workforce. So we have to now start thinking about retraining our workforce, moving up the ladder, implementing the magic that we see in companies like Singapore and Finland, because again, this is why the report is relevant, because it tells you how these small population countries, the type of policies that they're implementing to move themselves up the ladder. How did Singapore become one of the most innovative nations on this earth? Is by having national policy, by investing in its people. So we need to start thinking along those lines and rethinking how we attack globalization. And we have to accept the fact that it's a globalized world. We have to understand where the revenue of these companies is coming from. And we need to basically start developing policies which let us understand these new, basically understand the globalized world and develop new business models to benefit from it. We need, rather than teaching more math and science, we should also teach more geography, teach more, teach more literature, teach more history, to balance out our kids and to teach them more about what's happening globally.
Anyway, thank you. Yeah.
Yes, is my mic on? Well, I don't know where to begin. I've been taking so many notes. There's so many things we agree on, a few things we may disagree on, but a couple of comments about the report. I want to add my congratulations to getting in one place some very substantial and significant numbers. Metrics are important at the end of the day, and I think our conversations start to move that way. However, metrics are not everything. One metric I don't see in here is where are the jobs going to be. At the end of the day, that's something we have to care about deeply in this country. And so, while we absolutely must understand what is going on globally, which we tend not to, and thank goodness for folks like John and Vivek who keep this in front of us, these models that all we will do is put together great ideas and outsource everything is great, get some money moving into the United States with 10 people in a venture capital firm, 100 people in an office, but if it's 10,000 jobs and they're all created elsewhere, we're in trouble. So at some point we have to start worrying about that. If you stop to think about the numbers in Rob's report, paint some really bizarre pictures of the United States. I think we would all agree, yep, we're on the top or we're close to the top, but the gradients are all going in the wrong direction. That we would all agree with. But here we are, highest tax rate and best place to do business. I mean, these are sort of strange ironies that are woven throughout here.
We took the tax part out of that metric.
I understand. I understand. I absolutely agree with John's assertion that there is more to innovation than just science and engineering, that there is more to education than just fixing STEM subjects in our K through 12. But I have to tell you, I believe, nonetheless, these are not only necessary, though not sufficient conditions, they are the sine qua non. This country has got to take another look, rebuild its belief in education, what it can accomplish, and inspiring young people. And let me just mention a little bit, just some anecdotes about some of the countries that we've been talking about here today. First of all, Finland. So think about Finland. Huge land mass, relatively modest population. Finland has had forever exactly 2 natural resources, period. Trees, they have reindeer. And that is it. There is nothing else in Finland. So they've got to run on mind power. For a while, they drove their economy by making paper, basically, using those trees to good advantage. They got really good at that. Days of that passed by, so they started doing other things. Anybody know what Nokia's first product was? Nokia's first product was boots made out of reindeer skin. That's how they started. So talk about an innovation chain. Where's the weakness? About 75% of everything that happens in Finland happens in one company. So they don't have a sustainable ecology. They have to keep inventing. We at least have some nice distribution. Secondly, a little bit on this nature of education. Back in about 98, I guess it was, when China announced that they were anointing 7 of their universities to become world-class research institutions, the presidents of those 7 universities came to the United States, and we had a very quiet, off-site, 2-day meeting with an equivalent number of U.S. university presidents up at Harvard. And I remember the first day we went around the table. What do? You introduce yourself. So U.S. university presidents went around. We had a Renaissance scholar, we had a linguist, we had a political scientist, a person who'd come up through the business school route, we had one mechanical engineer. You've got the idea. We all came from different fields. Then we went around the Chinese university presidents. Out of the 7, we had 6 physicists and 1 physicist who had gotten a master's degree in computer science and started moving in that direction. So they started off with a very utilitarian, focused view of universities, and that will get you only so far. I met about 3 years ago when I spent a couple of weeks in Singapore. I spent a lot of time with the then education minister, Thorman. I think he's now economics minister, actually. And I was there as a so-called expert on higher education. We talked a lot. We were around Biopolis, the research universities, and so forth. And so toward the end of this 2-week period, I was having lunch with the minister, and I said, well, look, I've tried to help you with what little I know about universities. We got big problems with our primary and secondary education. Your kids blow ours out of the water on all the standard testing. Here was his answer. You know, to my question, what can we learn from you in this regard? His answer was, we can show you exactly how to bring the average up. We are really good at bringing the average up. But you know what? We don't know what to do with a really creative case. Simultaneously, their universities, not quite as dramatic as Alvar Aalto in Finland, but the National University of Singapore has a big input of money to build their humanities and social sciences. So all these places are going to lose that. And I actually fear that we're going to lose our biggest advantage when that happens. And that to me is that our engineers and our scientists not only learn their subjects generally pretty well once they get there, but they learn it in this milieu where they continually mix with people with other perspectives, ways of thinking. And I think that's led to a lot of our creativity and entrepreneurship. We're going to lose that comparative advantage very, very quickly. Now, let me just say a little bit about the sort of nature of globalization as I see it in research and development and education. First of all, if you took this map, and let's just make a real map again, and simply look at the United States, Europe, and Asia, you would find that today the total R&D investment, public plus private, in each of those 3 areas of the world is about the same. We've moved very close to a third, a third, a third. I will tell you, even a decade ago, it wouldn't have looked like that. So all this is spreading around. Where are the young professionals? If you look at the U.S., India, and China in particular, you will instantly see 3 things. If you look at some of the key areas of business and accounting, of engineering, and of biology or life sciences, only in life sciences is the U.S. ahead of these other 2 areas, and only by a little bit. Engineers, as we all know, no matter what numbers we kid each other about, China is just totally dominating already. We're talking about young professionals, people 5, 6 years out in the workforce from universities. And in business and accounting, actually India is totally off the charts compared with the others. So I'm just saying this talent is moving around. So we would expect, obviously, China to be educating a lot more engineers than the United States and with a larger population. But the number I like to look at is what is the fraction of our students who graduate from university in fields like engineering and science. It's very interesting. Science, that percentage is almost constant across North America, Europe, and Asia. A little under 20%, somewhere between 50 and 20%. But in engineering, only 4.5% of our kids graduate in these fields. About 13–14% in Europe, and 20% across Asia. And if you look specifically at China, it would be much higher than that. Now, engineers are important, and I say that not just because I happen to be the president of the National Academy of Engineering at the moment, but I like to quote my friend Floyd Kwame, one of the real original Silicon Valley venture capitalists, who defines venture capital as a search for smart engineers. We need engineers, and we need engineers who interface with science, we need engineers who interface with business, social sciences, and even with humanities, and we need them in more numbers. One word on K-12. There's one variable, if you look into this, how we teach science, math, and so forth, it really stands out. The most important variable turns out to be, and study after study shows in different ways, how are their teachers educated? And if you look at Japan, Korea, Singapore, the countries we've been talking about here, their high school and even elementary teachers in these fields have degrees in math, science, or engineering and devote their careers to teaching. We are the lowest on that number. Our kids learn these subjects by and large from people who have no fundamental training in the fields we teach. That's among the things we have to change to get started. Now, finally, just to kind of close out, I want to say two things. I believe our biggest problems in the United States are cultural. Eventually, it's got to be policy to drive things, investment to drive things, but we have just gotten fat, sassy, and complacent. And it's because we think we're number one, because what do we look? We look at these numbers. Hey, we've got the largest GDP per adult. We're second most productive according to your term, so forth and so on. We don't look at the things that tell us what's really going on in the world. What's the quality of our environment? Where are the jobs going to be 10 years from now? We've got to get more of a future orientation. And we've got to inspire our young people to get hungry, like the people in Singapore have been, like the people in China are, like the Finns are, each for their own different reasons. We've got to inspire young people again to look at the future and figure out how it is they're going to be contributing to solving the really big problems. Because if you look at the big problems that are facing the world, whether it is energy or climate change, water, productivity, you just keep going down the list, healthcare, medicine, food. These require strong science and engineering inputs, and they require a real spirit of innovation and ability to change things and do them more effectively, efficiently. And I find that this is the kind of thing that turns young people on today. It's not Sputnik and Apollo. I have to tell you, that was 50 years ago, hard to believe. And it may not even be the IT industry, because they've grown up breathing it, living it. It's got to be, what are the new problems out there to solve? What's exciting? What do I want to get passionate about? We have to bring that. And finally, while we've all had lots of reasons to be pessimistic, being an eternal optimist, I want to leave you with a few thoughts of weird things I've seen in newspapers recently that give me a little sense of optimism in this country. It may be, as hard as it is, that the lessons we're going to learn from this current financial crisis and the collapse of Lehman Brothers and so forth and so on, it may be that we learn some things, actually learn some things from this and adapt to them. Because remember, Winston Churchill once said famously, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other possibilities. Well, we've been exhausting a lot of possibilities. Maybe now we'll see the future. And the reason I say that is suddenly you read in the newspapers, you even hear from the lips of politicians the term the real economy. It suddenly dawned on people that there is an economy we think about that's basically moving numbers around on pieces of paper, and there's an economy that has to do with producing products and services that really add value. Real economy. Keep using that, thinking about it. I actually read in a newspaper article a couple of months ago the question, should General Motors have been investing more in R&D all these years? You see the question, where are the jobs going to come from? How are they going to be created? You see that people are beginning to realize that part of the reason we got into this economic mess is that sort of a third generation on Wall Street was beginning to use very sophisticated computer models for measuring risk, and they didn't have the foggiest idea what was really behind them, what the assumptions were, what the model really was. And finally, I noticed that as we got into the discussion of this strange situation we got ourselves into trying to burn food in our cars with corn-based ethanol, it suddenly is beginning to actually dawn on the public and politicians that there is a relationship between what we do with our corn and how an impoverished person in Africa is able to eke out a living and what happens to the environment. There suddenly is a little bit of actual systems thinking going on. And this is something we all need. So I'm rambling, but it's all to say that our speakers, and especially the metrics in your report, Rob, are very thought-provoking. And whatever we can do to just try to shake the country out of its complacency and its lack of forward vision is going to be very helpful, and we salute you for doing just that.
I would, first of all, thank you all three. Great comments, and appreciate you making them to be here. Let me just take the liberty of making 4 comments in response, and then we'll open it up to you all for questions and comments. One is, as Chuck was talking about the current crisis, I don't think one can divorce what's going on in the financial economy, which is now rippled into the real economy, with what we see in the study. I don't think they're unrelated. The fact that the U.S. is 40th in progress since around 2000 is, to me, quite related to the current financial and economic meltdown. If for no other reason than much of it was driven by foreign investment flows looking for investment opportunities, which there weren't enough real investment opportunities in the U.S., and so we had, if you will, pseudo-investment opportunities like houses, which were not part of the what we call a real or sustainable wealth model. So I do think those things are connected, and to say they're somehow completely separate. We're in this major financial crisis and economic crisis, but somehow what we're seeing here on innovation and competitiveness is not related, I think is wrong. The second point is both John and Vivek in particular talked about the importance of new metrics or better metrics. I 100% wholeheartedly agree with that. And our challenge, both with this study and the study we also do with support of the Kauffman Foundation, the State New Economy Index, is you just have to deal with the metrics that are there. And I know OECD is working on a new project to get better metrics. Greg Tassi in the back with NIST has been thinking about that question as well. We really do need to think much more deeply and get better data. Europe, by the way, has thought about this more systematically than we have and is working on this. The third point I want to make is you sensed a little bit of, I think, different orientations or focus here from some of the speakers. But I think ultimately everybody was in consensus. John was stressing more the innovation system, a little bit on the demand side. Chuck was a little more on the supply side, about kind of the more science and technology part. They both would acknowledge, I believe they both work together and critical. Unfortunately, not everybody in that debate has that synthesis. There's too many people in the debate who will argue it's either all on the supply side, so just crank up more scientists, everything will be fine, or it's all on the demand side, or it's all about innovation systems, or it's all about supply. I think those are false debates, and when people argue them, I think they're missing sort of one half of the puzzle there. So we really need to focus on both supply and demand, innovation broadly, as well as the core components of it. Last point is with regard to education that Chuck alluded to. And I think you were mentioning Singapore. Interesting study is a new study in the Journal of Gifted Education compares gifted students in Singapore with the U.S. And what is striking about it is that Singapore actually is much more focused on gifted students than we are. We, I think, are focused much more on this is what the study shows, much more focused on the average student. And the people, teachers, for example, have much less training than the average Singaporean teacher in how to deal with gifted students. Singapore at least has made a conscious national strategy that they're actually going to work with all students, but they're actually going to treat gifted students as they should be treated, as gifted, not as just normal or average. And we see that, for example, in recent articles. People saw it on Thomas Jefferson High School over here. We've been big proponents of moving more to math and science high schools, STEM academies. There are about 100 of these in the country. We had a proposal with the American Competes Act to create a $20 or $30 million program at NSF to create these math and science academies. Well, Thomas Jefferson, which is an unbelievably great school, if you haven't seen it or been there, it's in Alexandria, Science and Technology High School. There was a recent case where they kicked out a kid, European American, Caucasian, whatever you want to say, because he wasn't getting good enough grades, and you got to do well there. You got to get good enough grades. And there was a backlash that said we need affirmative action for Caucasians because it's not fair. Now, this to me is a very troubling thing. So here are these kids who are Asian, Indians, whatever, who are working their tail off to do really, really well, and we're saying somehow that's unfair. That's how far we've come from not a meritocracy. So I really do think that there's a challenge here that we have to say we are for excellence and not just kind of mediocrity. That's obviously, by the way, one last part of that, when we worked with the science principals on this thing, they said the biggest challenge they face in their school districts is the charge of elitism. So if elitism is taking your smartest kids and giving them a really good environment, if that's now what the term of elitism, I think we're in real trouble. So that's, I think, a major challenge we face. So, open it up now to your all comments or questions. If you could raise your hand and then identify yourself. We'll go in the back here first, then here, and then here. Ma'am, we don't have any mics, so just...
Okay, Robin Holster. And I'm here representing the National Center for Women in Information Technology. And I wanted to ask our speakers, as well as our author, about the data that you've collected with regard to diversity. There's interesting thought that innovation is very much tied to diversity. And if you look at the numbers of particularly women, but also a number of underrepresented minorities, at least in the United States, you see an incredible picture of very, very few women compared to, for example, the participation of women in the biological sciences, etc. I'm wondering if you did any collection of any information, either data or anecdotal, about the role of participation of girls and women in innovating those new products and services that will make sense both for the marketplace as well as for the lab.
We didn't. I don't think the data are available. The one anecdote I will say is in our study where we looked at science high schools, girls are overrepresented relative to their population in normal high schools in science, partly because the environment for them is so much more accepting. It's acceptable to be smart if you're a girl in these science high schools. So I think that's an interesting institutional innovation that they've created, but beyond that, I don't know. So if you all have thoughts.
Let me say a little bit, since I've become the supply side expert, let me say a word about that, and then a couple of things anecdotally. In my humble opinion, this remains a serious problem. And you know, if I look back on my MIT experience, I can certainly give you the good numbers. I can tell you that MIT's undergraduate population is about 48% women at this point, and that came a long way in a short space of time. And you can say the same thing at many of the other leading institutions, even Caltech, which, because of the small numbers, had a particularly difficult journey. Their undergraduates' population of women starting looks very good. Now, if you go discipline by discipline, however, you will find that there remain, for some reason nobody fully understands, huge discrepancies. And fields such as physics, and for a reason I really don't understand, computer science, remain among the lowest of where the women will tend to go academically. Kind of have been macho fields, but on the other hand, biology's been a macho field. So there's some deep things to sort out there. I will tell you that my own anecdotal experience, both as an educator and also from experience serving on the boards of two major corporations for quite a few years, when you look into what's really important today, teamwork, interdisciplinary work, etc., the women, for whatever reason, statistically rise really well. And so I think there's a talent there. We have, again, some cultural problems, going to take us forever, but I think we still have to be very explicit about that. And I would love to see some of these data. I know some of the data in Europe, and there again, country by country, you can find A that does very well and B that's 5 decades behind the United States. But I think this issue of diversity and what it means to the intellectual and cultural mix remains something we need to talk about openly and continually.
Thank you.
So maybe just to add one note, you know, Finland and Singapore are not exactly the most diverse countries, you know, and so it's been interesting to me to see how, from a policy perspective, they've tried to create mechanisms for generating diversity. So Singapore, as some of you may know, actually has an explicit intention to import as many as 500,000 to 1 million members of the global creative class to, in effect, generate diversity that they can't have indigenously. And Finland is also giving consideration to, you know, insularity and being outside in as well as an inside out kind of society. And a lot of what's going on there is about building business bridges to hotspots like other hotspots like Silicon Valley. So if you're not born with it, you have to engineer it, and there seems to be some good thinking going on in that area.
I think the Finnish strategy is to import Swedes.
They did that. Some success.
Well, indigenously, we could incorporate more females and other underrepresented minorities.
Why don't we go right here?
Thank you.
Rob, thank you. Great data.
Identify yourself for everybody.
Sorry?
Can you identify yourself?
Roger London with Chesapeake Crescent. So Singapore invested in its people. How did they raise? Where did the funding come for that, and at what expense? There's no free lunch. Did GDP drag a little bit because there was heavy taxes, or was unemployment higher? So how did they pay for that without some huge expense on the other side?
Well, I mean, it's obviously a society where there's a certain amount of national social engineering, and so if you start out with no natural resources and a tiny footprint and a lot of people who are concerned about survival, accomplish interim goals before you become the Xanadu of innovation. I mean, I remember when I visited Singapore as a boy, it was just a sort of a kind of a smelly fishing village. There was nothing there except some really good food. So the strategies of setting themselves up as a initially low value added manufacturing center, as a service center, which stressed low cost, and kind of climbing up a value chain to the point where they are now, in OECD standards, took a long time. It took 40 plus years of really hard work. So they couldn't, it's like a Maslow's hierarchy. They couldn't really get to, a Biopolis until they'd gone through the other stages of forming capital and, creating a national ethos and, forming basic institutions like a military, right? And, having the emphasis on certain core values like virtually universal home ownership and, the policies around real estate development and land ownership and things of this kind. So I think it was, it's been quite a drama that has gone back over 40 years of several waves of, in essence, societal and economic innovation to get to where they are now. It didn't happen overnight. I mean, nobody gave them a big loan and said, okay, go out and be innovative, and you pay us back later.
And I think, John, you would agree with this. They started this, however, simply by attracting companies from other countries all around the world and providing that service infrastructure. That's really how they did it.
Well, interestingly enough, so you're absolutely right. I mean, this whole idea that Singapore was going to be the preferred multinational jumping off point because of business ethics and simple business practices and great service, okay, which was kind of the model several decades ago. You see an interesting echo of that now in this polishing the jewel strategy. So if you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and they say, oh, we'll give you up to 50% of your hard costs of R&D as a grant. All you have to do is locate your lab in Singapore. We'll give you all of these kind of Singaporean treats for coming over here. I mean, their goal explicitly is to capture 200 to 300 world-class ventures and rebrand them as Singaporean companies. And so it's kind of an extension of that service platform strategy of the new economy.
I'm going the order I saw them, so right here, a lot of hands. I'll do the best I can. So right here, and then Mike, and then there was one back there. So why don't we try to keep questions short and try to keep answers short and get everybody.
Thanks. My name is Chris Gallagher. I'm from Carmen Group, and I want to compliment you on your study. I wanted to ask about another I, which I think Schumpeter would agree with us is perhaps the enemy of innovation, and that's incumbency, and the inertia of incumbency, and the influence of incumbency. Incumbents support the foundations, the politicians, everyone else. So there's a resistance. We've seen it with the auto industry. We're seeing it with financial services. Right now, the incumbent megatechs and innovation are proposing patent reform, which is designed to dilute the return on investment in patents and to reduce their reliability. There'll probably be a press conference tomorrow announcing this year's version of it. My question is, have you built into your study any metrics that account for the influence of incumbency, which would account for why the United States is where it is? And secondly, what is your opinion of the importance of getting this IP question right before Congress? Because if we don't, clearly entrepreneurial venture capital is gone, and the National Venture Capital Association has said so.
Yeah. We actually didn't use patent data in the study because we think it's not all that representative. It's partly a reflection of legal climate and propensity to patent. But having said that, I 100% agree with you with incumbents. We recently did an op-ed with Mark Cooper from the Consumer Federation of America on the auto bailout, saying if you're going to give the auto industry money, you should tie it to also passing a law that would prevent car dealers from banning the sales of cars by the big three. It's against the law for Ford to sell you a car. They have to sell it through, you go to Brazil, they can sell cars on the internet. So a Brazilian car company, you go to the internet, buy a car, configure it, get delivered to your house. You can't do that here because car dealers do that. Real estate agents are proposing only. So you're absolutely right. I do have to say I probably disagree with you on patent reform. We have a report on patent reform. I think this patent reform that is there. I do think it's a little bit overblown in terms of the fear of entrepreneurship. I do think if you do patent reform right, which we think is needed, you can deal with some of the real problems in the patent system, but without getting into some of those issues. I think there was a Mike, you had a question here.
Mike Maybach with European American Business Council. We probably have a new Secretary of Commerce soon.
Maybe.
Who knows? And if we do, you talked about the U.S. acting as a state. What would you want that new Secretary of Commerce to do differently than the current person?
Pay his taxes. That would be the first thing. Yeah, I think the fact that it's a governor, and also Gary Locke, who's I think a very innovative governor when he was governor of Washington State, bodes well for maybe them being able to grasp this mental transformation that has to occur. The governor gets that. Obviously, you can't be a governor for more than a month before you figure this out. So what would I want them to do? What I would want Governor Locke, assuming he becomes Secretary Locke, would be to essentially start to craft a national innovation strategy. I think one of the first things the Obama administration could and should do would be to create a national commission of high-level folks who are and have John on it, and have Vivek on it, and Chuck, that really tries to think this through about what is specific thing to do. There are lots of ideas of what we can actually do. You know, I would ramp up, for example, MEP and ITIF at NIST. Howard Wild has left, but Howard and I co-authored a paper with Brookings and ITIF on the National Innovation Foundation.
A bit like the Young Commission back in the 80s?
Exactly. I mean, the Young Commission was quite, as you know, or everybody remembers those days. John Young, Hewlett-Packard CEO, had the Young Commission under Ronald Reagan. It's very influential. It was the predecessor of the Council of Competitiveness. So I think we need a new Young Commission, absolutely. I think we had a question back here from Dean, and then all the way to the back.
Dean Garfield from ITIC. Last night there was a veiled reference in the President's speech to not rewarding through the tax code offshoring of U.S. jobs. What are your thoughts on how the tax code and the U.S. marginal tax rate plays into innovation?
You know, I don't think that the tax code has incented companies to go abroad, but it could incent companies to keep research over here. You know, rather than being negative and xenophobic, as I see the new political climate, I'd much rather that see them being proactive now and saying, okay, you know, these companies have these incentives. This is what the costs look like, and this is what's happened. The cat's out of the bag right now. How do we move forward? Okay, how do we now make it worthwhile for IBM to have more research in these types of areas in these territories? Now that smacks of industrial policy. But if you look at Singapore, look at Finland, look at these countries, it's industrial policy. It's not a level playing field. China is industrial policy. China basically, you go over there, they'll bend over backwards, they'll do anything they can to get you to move your R&D to their regions and so on. If everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't we be doing it? I mean, and the fact is we're losing out by not doing it, by not being aware of how things have changed. So again, to recap what I said, rather than being negative, I'd rather be positive.
Mark Lapkin with ATT. Just a quick question.
Mark, a little louder, please.
Sure. My question is actually about whether or not there's a silver lining in the current financial crisis. I remember in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a lot of discussion about how the Cold War was responsible in some way for our loss of ground in comparison to Japan. We were so focused on the actual on the Cold War and Cold War spending and military spending that all of our best and brightest were actually headed to military type projects. And today we've had a lot of our best and brightest heading into the financial industry. Now that those jobs don't look as profitable as they once were, is there an opportunity to bring more of the best and brightest into what you refer to as the real economy?
Well, people in Silicon Valley have always known that innovation tends to flower in times of recession. I mean, a lot of the big technology leap aheads occurred in recessionary periods. And if we look back at the economic history of the United States, a lot of the prestige companies in the Fortune 50 got born during